Do we know where our children are? Do we know what our children are up to? One policy can impact a whole generation of people.
The young person 10 years ago is completely different to the young person now.
The system wasn't designed to help all.
So this content may include explicit material, so please view at your own discretion. The intention is not to offend, but to provide information. Please only proceed if you are comfortable with sensitive topics. Welcome to Mek Sense with Melzy, where we make sense of the world we live in through real culture conversations. I am Melzy J, just in case you didn't know my name. So today we are talking about a topic that's really, really close to my heart. And I had to find the right person for this, okay? We couldn't really get any and anybody, right? I like to speak to people that are 100% certified. I've seen their work. I've spoken to their staff. I've seen the level of respect and recognition they've gained over the last decade. So I'm going to welcome my guest. He is a criminologist. He's an urban youth specialist, CEO of several, can I just point out, several with a capital S. Let's not down talk it. Several organizations, Solve, the Centre for Youth and Violence and Conflict, and Solve Housing, providing Ofsted registered children's homes based in the West Midlands. Let's welcome the legend, Craig Pickney. Woo, 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 woo.
Big introduction that was there.
Big introduction. Da, 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 da.
That's an honor, and thank you for having me. As you said, it's a poignant topic. It's one that's close to not just our hearts, but many of your viewers. So let's get into it, man.
Let's get into it first. Like, how are you? How's things? Mad gym games. Wagwan. Wagwan.
I'm good. I'm in a good space. Things are just moving in the right direction. The team's building. We're enabling people in our community to have opportunity. I always say that that's always one of my biggest kind of goals, is that I want to be in a position to bless people, to have an opportunity to provide for their families through work opportunities. And yeah, man, it's I've changed the direction in terms of the lane, in terms of what I want to occupy, in terms of helping the nation or helping specifically children, young people and families. So I'm good, man. I'm in a good space.
You look great. Yeah. Like, you know, like I said, like, it's really, I've been wanting to catch up with you for a minute.
It's been a while.
It's been a while, a good couple of years. I wanted you from like New Style Radio days. Do you know what I mean? So it's a beautiful thing that I've got you in this space. You know, we know each other personally and in terms of peers as well. Yeah. And I've met some of your members of staff and they just literally scream your praises. Yeah. And you just do some amazing work. So it was only right to get you on the podcast because I feel like there's some important things that we really, really need to just talk about. Well, before we do that, we always start the show with telling the audience what don't make sense to you and what does make sense to you. Yeah. So firstly, what don't make sense to you at the moment,
what
Craig?
Doesn't make sense to me? When I go to the cinemas, I get excited about going to the cinemas and I drop asleep.
No.
It happens all the time. It could be the best film. Like, I never forget. I remember when Avatar first came out. Listen, I got the whole camp that we all had to go this date, this time. Got the tickets. Yeah.
You fell asleep. You didn't even get like.
You know what it is? It's got to be the lighting. I'm convinced that with my neurodiverse needs and something to do with light, it does something. Because when I'm at home and I want to relax, I watch things like The Simpsons. And it really calms me. Yeah. So it's got to be something to do with lighting. My friends will sit there and say, no, I'm lying. But I'm convinced. So that don't make sense to me. I can get so excited about something and still fall asleep.
Yeah, that's a bit random. And then you spend your money as well on popcorn and all them
slush, popcorn, everything's just
yeah, because cinema trip's like £25 per person if you're getting snacks. Do you know what I mean? Like, or sometimes you got to bring in your own snacks just to make sure it's a bit, you know what I mean? Okay, that's interesting. So we won't be going to cinema with Craig anytime soon because he's going to fall asleep and waste the ticket.
No, if I'm going with the kids, it's cool.
You can
As
just
long as I'm making sure that they're all right. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
good. Yeah.
So what does make sense to you?
What does make sense to me? Doing a job that you love.
Oh, I love that.
Doing a job that you love. I've always been that type of person. If I don't like something, I just don't do it.
I love that.
Yeah, so doing a job you love makes sense.
Makes sense. It would
Yeah.
make sense. Okay, what does make sense to me is happiness, like putting yourself first and not just saying it,
Yeah.
but actually doing it. There's one thing saying it and be like, I'm gonna put myself first, but there's a next thing putting your phone on D&D and having a day out just to do yourself.
Yeah.
What doesn't make sense to me is my sister's birthday's coming up, right? And I'm like the family planner. I will be like, what's you doing for your birthday? Where are we going? What you doing? And she's just like, oh, I've got no plans. Don't really want to do anything. And I'm like, but it's your birthday. Like, I want to do something. Can we plan? Like, can't be bothered. And that just doesn't make sense to me. Like, why don't you want to celebrate yourself? Why?
I get it.
Do you get what I mean?
No, I get why.
People don't want to.
Sometimes, yeah.
Why though?
I'm just the same.
Are you?
I'm good in my own time and space.
So what, you don't like turn up for your birthday? But does anyone else around you turn up for your birthday?
Because I got used to me not doing that. So they're just going to become accustomed to it.
See,
But they know I'm happy and they know I'm good.
yeah, but why don't you want to let people celebrate you on your birthday?
I was get celebrated in different ways. Like I'm never been a person that, and I think maybe just to my parenting and my family background, we've never waited for one day to.
I get that.
So when you're doing it consistently, like I'll always have the family around. I'll always do things with family. So I hear that, but I feel like when I speak to my peers, they will be like, for example, Christmas is the only time that we link up, but that's not the only time I link up with all my folks.
Yeah, me too. Yeah,
So when it's the one thing, I get it. I'm saying I get it, but equally I get it when it's just like, yeah, it's really not that deep.
Every day
Because
your birthday.
I'll go out with my boys all the time. We travel, so there's nothing really, and we're celebrating each other every time that we're out and we're doing something.
So
anyway.
maybe I need to like lower my tone when it comes to birthdays then. 'Cause
You do you, but it's about understanding the other.
yeah, I
That's
find
my
it difficult.
thing.
Even my friend,
Yeah.
like she's a Jehovah's Witness and she never really celebrated birthdays and she's like my best friend, like she's like my sister. And I'm like, right, it's your birthday, we get you a card, let's do this. Where we go? I'm not bothered. And I find it really difficult because I'm like, but I want to celebrate you. I want to spoil you, even though I know I spoil her all the time. I'm like, it's your birthday. I want to go extra. I'm extrovert, as you can tell.
But then it's a deeper question. I feel like we're getting all psychological.
Oh, let's
tonight.
go.
It's a deeper question because it more might be a reflection about you as opposed to the person.
What do you think it is? Maybe like, what kind of reflection? Tell me. I want to know.
I don't know. Sometimes that when you are in a transition, as we spoke about in the beginning, or you have an element of yourself that maybe want to be celebrated, you kind of pour into other people's glasses, don't you? So in those moments, you probably like, you know what? No one probably don't turn up for me, so let me use this as an opportunity for me to turn up to you. So maybe that
could be a thing.
That could be a thing.
I'm gonna look into that. That could be a thing.
Yeah, it could be a thing.
Right. So let's go from the start because I don't know how this conversation is gonna go because there's just so much to dissect. There's so much I want to say and talk to you about. Like, we have plans, but the plans might not go to plan.
Yeah, no, it's all good.
Because we're people's up in this. So for you, like, what was it that initially made you want to get involved with working with young people? What was the penny that dropped for you initially?
I don't think that there was a penny that dropped. I get asked this question all the time. I think I grew into my purpose. As a child growing up, my family members were involved in community work. My grandparents, my aunts, my uncles. And I guess as any kid in any family, you're not really looking at what the elders are doing, and it's only until you get to maybe your teens, your early 20s, where you kind of start asking questions like, oh, that's what grandma was on, and that's what my uncle's on, and you go certain places and everybody was seeing, but like, are you related to such and such? And you're getting this big reception of connected to these particular individuals. And I guess, leaving school with no qualifications that would have enabled me to get into college properly. Youth work as a voluntary option at that time became a thing that then manifested into so many other different things and opportunities. And I think when I then got the opportunity to go to university, even when I was at university, I still was kind of questioning, like, is this really what I want to do? And it was only meeting, you know, amazing human beings like Dr. Carlton Housen at the time, and Kemi Folarin, and you know, Mamadou, and some of those lecturers that were there that kind of made me look at myself in a different type of way. So I would never say that there was a particular penny, but I think through my journey of university, leaving the university and then working at my first youth centre, which is kind of where I grew around anyway, Oakland Youth Centre in Handsworth, watching those young people coming in and out of those buildings, and, you know, watching, I guess, what happened and transpired many years later. You know, many of them turn into crime, many of them becoming victims of crime, you know, many of them sadly taking their lives over the young people. I would say that's when the penny dropped for me to want to know more about these young people.
Yeah, because it's like,
and specifically
why?
young men.
Yeah.
And young black men, to be specific. Why is that going on? So I would say if there was a penny, it was more later as opposed to getting into youth work, because I felt like it was just part and part of the natural progression of what my family and what we were doing anyway.
So it's in your DNA.
Yeah, in the DNA, 100%.
Kind of similar for me, really. Like, I think it was a teacher, actually. I had a student that I was supporting, and this was when I was fully in my performing arts. Bearing in mind, I'm at college. Like,
I did performing arts too.
Did you? Yeah. So I did performing arts, and I was teaching this play. This is England. And I had to teach this young white boy to be really aggressive, but he was really soft, really cute. And we did some kind of like character building work, and I found out that he used to be bullied, and I helped him overcome certain things. I was 16, 17 doing that with someone my age. And a teacher that I've got, I think I've said this story on the podcast already, but we'll say it again. I had a teacher called Claire, and she's like, you should go to London and work with like disadvantaged young people, like, you know, and use arts as a way. And I was like, wow, you can actually do that. Like, is that something that you can do? And she was like, yeah, you know, and I literally applied for university 2 weeks before it started, and literally left and went to London and did performing arts and community development. And I've just been working with young people ever since. But you see the different, you must know over working decades with young people, the young person 10 years ago is completely different to the young person now.
Yeah, in some ways. Obviously, because the things that young people had 10 years ago are very different to now. Biggest thing is social media and technology. You know, technology is forever growing. You know, we're now talking about artificial intelligence. You know, I had to ride up the road to my friend's house on my bike, you know, for his mum to say, you know, he's not here, he might be back in 2 hours. And to ride back 2 miles, wait the 2 hours, and then ride back up the road. Now we've got WhatsApp. Now we've got PlayStation. Now we've got Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok, and the list goes on. So communication in terms of the way in which we discourse is different. You know, eye contact, like we played outside, you know, tig and tag, Kirby's, hide and seek. You know, we was a little bit extreme, knock door run, kick door run. I'm gonna throw that one out, but it was human interaction.
Yeah, it was.
So you look at the generations now, there's not really much interaction, and you have to really take those things and those little nuances into consideration, because when you're thinking about how do they engage with people that have difference and each other, it's very, very, very different. So we can say, you know, violence has always been here, because it has.
Always.
You know, we can say that, you know, exploitation has always been here, because it has.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit different now when you consider all of those differences as well, and those challenges. We're talking about the education system. So only now they're acknowledging, you know, neurodiversity and how autism, how ADHD, Asperger's, dyslexia, and all of these different needs that people require had not been met by the education system, and therefore exclusions, managed moves that put them in alternative provisions, pupil referral units, then creates that kind of conveyor belt of vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities of individuals and groups exploit those, whether that's gangs, whether that's drugs, whether that's fraud, whether that's sexual exploitation, whether that's radicalization, extremism, and the list goes on. So it's very easy to look at and say, oh, the young people are different today. Well, they are, because it's a different society that we're in right now.
Yeah.
We wasn't in a hyper technological society. Everything is globalized by media and social media, and that's part of the reason why I decided to do a PhD in this, to want to get people to understand that our worlds now are globalized in the context of social media.
Yeah.
So if I want to know what's going on in London or Leeds or Manchester,
Yeah.
all I need to do is go to Instagram.
Yeah. And you find
Whereas back in the day, unless you was connected to people that knew something and they were brilliant storytellers, you didn't have a clue what was going on. But that doesn't remove the fact that the dangers and the vulnerabilities were always there.
obviously Birmingham's like one of the highest gun capitals, and there's a lot going on here. And I hear things that happen because of the profession that I'm in,
Yes.
but I still don't see it as someone that's in Birmingham.
Yeah.
It's probably twice that I've probably been in a proximity where I've heard a gunshot. But then because I work with young people, I know it's happening.
Of course.
Like, I see the vulnerability of the parents, of the young people, that young person being in hospital, this young person being this, and speak to all of the different organisations that support that. So I do think social media has highlighted probably more what's happening, but I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing.
And I think I always have those, I guess, conversations with the team about what social media does. And I think some people would argue that it's about awareness, and it's about people knowing and you know, not being ignorant.
Yeah.
But then there's also about what I talk about in my work about vicarious trauma. It's like you'll see people on social media platforms and they're uploading constantly kids stabbing each other or violent incidents, and they will say it's about awareness. But then when I think about it from a therapeutic perspective, do I need to always see that on my timeline? Do I always need to see that on your page? And if you're giving me information, is the information to traumatize me, or is the information to enable me to start thinking about how we can work together, or I can support the wider solution to reduce some of these issues within our community? And I think because we are in a technological space now, I think people have kind of forgot about those kind of nuances around trauma and the impact of trauma. And when I talk about trauma spreading, the vicarious stuff, that becomes really important. And I guess the deeper thing that I always talk about is I think people don't understand how to work with youth or communities.
Yeah.
Because there's a standard decline around working with communities. So I think anybody now that has a platform and has something to say now has a microphone or a camera just talking. And I think that sometimes is just as dangerous.
Yeah, just as dangerous.
Sometimes as the things that, you know, we would like to believe is something that we deem as positive.
Why do you think us as a community are not receiving the support that we need?
When you say us as a community, what do you mean?
The Black community, like in terms of young people. Obviously, I know we've got systematic racism. You see it in the schools. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
From my generation all the way up, I wasn't a naughty kid. I don't even know how I made it. Again, it took that one teacher to give me a little bit of a push, but all of the other teachers didn't really want to mess with me.
Yeah.
Now, I'm ADHD, and I've only really just recently discovered this. And that's why I can't concentrate for long periods of time. That's why I'm in the creative industry, and I don't like to do the same thing over and over again. And those are the things that weren't really picked up. And if I never pushed as a person, or I didn't have the right people around me, I probably wouldn't have made it to university. Yeah. So I can kind of understand how young children who can't educate themselves or can't be in an education system for whatever reason, are they getting the support that they need?
And I think to your question, the system wasn't designed to help all.
Yeah.
We can acknowledge that, but we also can't be ignorant to the games that ultimately is played. So you mentioned the education system. You know, we can look at, you know, policing, stop and search.
Yeah.
We can look at healthcare sector. We can look at mental health. And when you look at the statistics, when you're talking about whether it's Black or racial minoritized groups, the way in which they're treated compared to their white counterparts is fundamentally different. So I think one of the things as well, I think is important to talk about is how do we hold people accountable within these systems and institutions. And I think this is where, you know, the work that we do, especially at Solve, is around how do we mobilize communities and how do we get people challenging in the right arenas so we can hold those levels of accountability. So we almost kind of become like advocates also as well. Because there's one thing to say is that, that we know that the system may be racist, but then what do we do to respond to that? What's the information that we give into families, to communities, to young people about when you're coming against some of these challenges within the system? What do you need to do? But then it's also about, as I said, whether that's internally or externally, how are we holding people accountable? So, for example, in some of the roles that I do in terms of a consultant, I'll work with children's services and I'll look at their screening tools and I'll challenge, why is it, if a white young girl comes up and you see CSC or CCE, and just for your viewers, child sexual exploitation or child criminal exploitation, why is there always a different energy, for example, different to a young black child that ends up in a crack house and they're known for county lines? The umbrella terms that I just mentioned are still applied, and we have legislation like modern day slavery to enable us to create national referral mechanisms and safety and safeguarding to ensure that these young people are safe, despite acknowledging that there may have been a perpetrator, but we acknowledge that they're also victims also at the same time. Why don't we have the same energy? So our role is to hold people accountable to that. That if you're going to treat this young girl, for example, that comes from this particular background, let's equally treat the young boy exactly the same. So we understand that in our environment, that it's not just about race, it's also about class, and it's also about gender. And it's looking at those intersections and challenging what those things are. And I think one of the things that's also really important as well is really challenging people's biases and what they understand, because some of those biases are linked to their passions. You might say, listen, that, I just want to help young girls. I would say, why? And if we start to go through that kind of process of self-exploration that I call it, you might say, listen, you know what, the real reason why I do it is because this or something happened to me when I was a young girl. And that's your motivation of wanting to do that with girls that look like you. I can't wrong you for that. But with the concept of being a wounded healer, the question I would ask on top of that is, have you healed before you go out there supporting other young women? So my argument is, if everybody's holding these biases, that might be legitimate because you want to help people that look like you. I was the same. I just want to help young black boys. But what about if a young white boy comes into my youth centre? What about if a young Asian young boy comes into my youth centre? Am I saying that because my passion is with one category of young person, that I'm not going to give the same love and energy? And those are the questions that we need to challenge. So when I talk about the system, and I talk about challenging the system, looking at whether it's race, whether it's class, whether it's gender, and the misogynistic and behaviors that exist, we have to start looking at ourselves and challenging and holding people accountable to those things that are discriminatory, that's having an adverse impact on individuals and groups as a whole.
And I think it does go back to ignorance as well, isn't it? And like re-educating yourself, and people only seeing what they see. If you've not been around a black person before and you're quay up in where I remember I worked in a jail. I was a prison officer, or not that that's a bad thing. I taught radio broadcasting, and I met this Welsh guy, and he was like, I've never seen a black person since I've come to this jail. I says, what do you mean? I only saw a black person on TV. I'm like, what? And I don't know why it shocked me so much. Do you know what I mean? But again, like, that's where the discrimination comes in, the bias coming in. It's lack of education. But some people don't want to educate themselves. Some people just think, this is the way the world is. I don't need that. That's irrelevant to me. I don't really need to take part in that. Like, I'm not interested in drill music because that's, do you know what I mean? But it's difficult.
And I think that's kind of the way that the world works. And I guess our role as educators is to teach to the masses, and enable people to remove themselves from that ignorance, and people are going to pay attention to the things that they care about. And I think when we talk about accountability, you'll find that when there's an issue or a problem that then impacts those groups of people that are ignorant, then all of a sudden they want to be involved in those things. And I think I say there's accountability at all levels. There's accountability at government level. There's accountability from, the state in terms of, the authorities that have been funded by central government or local government to ensure that there's services. And then you've got the wider community, you've got families, and then you've got home. And I always say that there's accountability at all levels. You know, do we know where our children are? Do we know what our children are up to? Are we communicating with other parents? You know, are we ensuring that our children are wise enough to understand the difference between right and wrong? You know, do we understand social media? Do we understand what happens on social media? So it's not just about, you know, your child being at home and you're thinking they're safe because they're not outside, but the dangers could be on their mobile phones and their tablets and their devices. You know, do we understand the content that they're watching, what they're listening to, the films, whatever, games, you know, music, whatever that may be? And then are we educating ourselves, or at least connecting with other parents, that if we are in conflict, whether at school or whatnot, do we have the right information to be able to support our children through those particular journeys? So if you're saying that, you know, we experience racism, for example, at schools, I would question, do parents even know how to challenge racism within inside the school?
That's
and, you know, you know, I would say from our world, we know the individuals are advocates, we know school governors, and we know entities that we can rely on. But it's almost just like that other level of, do the community know and are they aware?
And the best way to do it as well, because the kids are at school the most when you look at it. So there is a level of importance to probably build a relationship with the teacher, to understand what's going on at school, to see whether you can do accuracy. But sometimes when nobody wants to be the parent that's complaining all the time, but you've got to back your kids. It's very important. You've got to let them know that we aren't institutions that have laws that shouldn't be doing certain things. And like you said, they need to be held accountable for that.
And it's just about understanding the ways in which you do that and how you approach that.
Do you think it's communication?
Definitely, but you've also got to go a step deeper than that as well. There's a lot of parents that are struggling too.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking about mental health. We just spoke about people with neurodiverse needs, fear and anxiety. You know, we're talking about institutions here. Which breeds a whole level of anxiety and fear in just even the word challenge, you know, becomes a big thing for other people. And you also have to acknowledge that, you know, we're in an economic crisis. You know, people are just trying to
get by.
Get by. So there's so many other things. And then you've got to worry about after school. Then you've also got to worry about activities that you probably can't afford. Nothing get free like it used to be
holidays,
free. You know, it's an absolute nightmare. So, you know, for a lot of parents, you know, they see the state, the schools, as that place of kind of like, I'm going to get a little respite whilst you're there. And whilst you may have some communities that are efficient, that have funding and finance and resources, they may not experience the same difficulty and challenges that others are. And it's not necessarily an excuse, but I think it's important to understand that when we talk about things like systematic racism, it's not just a thing of people just pointing a finger and saying they don't like you.
No.
It's called systematic for a reason. You know, one action or one policy can impact a whole generation of people. But it's about, how do we understand? How do we strategize? And then how do we start to challenge the things that will enable our children, ourselves, to navigate in a society that is highly racialized? And we see things that happen on the news all the time with, you know, fighting against communities, often based on disinformation and things that are not accurate and not true. But it's the society that we're in, and especially at a time when people are tense, at a time where there's you know, people are struggling for work, and people always want to blame somebody else, and it's another community's fault, and it's the migrants' fault, and you hear people say these things, but in actual fact, it's not the case. But these are the challenges of the day. You know, people just want to survive. People just want to get by, as you've just said. So they ain't got the time to mind boggle with themselves with all of the things that we're talking about. And it, you know, they hear these podcasts and say, oh, the words sound fancy, but I'm just trying to make ends meet for this week. I just want to make sure that we can get from Monday to Sunday and nobody doesn't go, you know, unfed, and nobody doesn't go, you know, saying that they're cold. And that's my priority. Anything extra is a burden. And I think when everybody's doing the same thing, regardless of what community that they're coming from, you see the ripple effects of that within the communities as a whole.
I feel like there's definitely importance, like you said, to like heal. And but if we talk about our parents' generation, on their parents' generation, therapy wasn't the thing, counseling wasn't the thing. Even talking about your feelings in a household, talking about sex or talking about certain things just it wasn't within our...
And that's why we go back to the point about systematic.
Yeah.
So you got also bearing in mind at a time where mental health, just as a whole, if one was to talk about their mental health, that might have meant that you got taken away.
Yes.
That might have meant that you got,
Sections,
you know, removed from your family. And going even further, it might have meant that your life was taken. So when you think about the generations and words like mental health, we speak of it from an advantage of a point of privilege. But when you think of communities, I think it's important that we understand that words can also demonstrate symbolic power. And throughout those particular words and language can initiate certain thoughts and feelings. Perfect example, young people in the police. Yeah, we've been in them situations. You're driving, you've got your license, you've got everything insured, everything else. But when you see a siren behind your car, how do you think and how do you feel?
Whoa, I'm driving like...
Okay.
I feel like I could get stopped. And yeah, it's mad. That is mad.
But that's linked to a whole host of things. The historical context of how the police have treated specific communities. Also, you've got the visualization of things that have happened in America and also the UK. You've also got the awareness that even when things are caught on camera, people still don't get brought to justice. So you've got all of those things going on in the space of 10 seconds. So let's flip that on its head now, going back to your previous point. When people hear words like mental health, talking about your feelings, you know, being open, that's like what I'm opening myself up for the open enemy to take me away. So you have to understand it in context. And then when we fast forward now to the time that we're in, of course, we can say, you know, therapy, as difficult as it is, because, you know, I go through therapy too. And I always say that, you know, therapy is a privilege.
It really is.
Because you also have to understand as well that therapy costs. So if you've got the dough and you've got the peas to do it, then of course you can afford it. But what about them same communities? Let's go to those families that we just mentioned that are just trying to make a way and ends meet. They're just trying to get through the week without no issues. Then they're dealing with a school. Then they're dealing with after school activities that they can't afford and the 6 weeks holiday that's coming.
And you want me to talk about my feelings.
And now you want to talk about my feelings. They don't have time to that. So what happens is...
as well sometimes as well. There's
obviously ways that we can do that for those that are working within communities. So one of the things that we do is we have a therapist. So young people that need therapy, they have access to free therapy. One of our arguments is that all children in schools should have access to therapy.
They should.
And we also believe the teachers should have access to clinical supervision as well.
Yeah.
You know, we can utilize funding and we can utilize charitable organizations to work in partnership with us to enable the society and the community to get those things. You know, there is a definite need for it, but you've also got to make it appetizing to the community as well. Because you going in just talking about, it's about mental health. I'm just going to just think about the same thing.
Yeah, they're going to be like, what? It's got to be so, kind of like, let's have a chat.
So when we do stuff with young people, we don't ever mention the word mental health.
Okay, that's interesting.
It might come up in a conversation. We might just be like, how the man them feeling?
I think that for the sisters, I think we're chatty patties. Girls are naturally chatty patties anyway, but I feel like men in general are not as open when it comes to...
And the statistics reflect that.
Feelings,
you know, all men, when you talk about suicide and mental health, you know, we see that when we're looking at suicide rates and whatnot. It's men is because we live in a society that deems that talking about your thoughts and your feelings is deemed as something that is weak.
Yeah.
So you've got men are kind of in this weird dichotomy where it's like, I want to talk about my feelings, but I'm going to be viewed as this. And then you've also got to bear in mind that there might be certain communities and there might be certain families that say, you know what, this is not something that we do. So there's almost like an ongoing battle. And I think that, you know, even just in my journey of when I talk about therapy, it's difficult when you've got so much responsibility and everybody's looking at you like, you can't crack. Because if you crack, everything's going to turn left. So there's also maintaining that as well. You've still got to go to work and you got to smile and you got to do all of these different things. But inside, a lot of men are going through those battles.
What do you think we could do, though, to kind of build that especially with the Black community? Like, what can we do to build the relationships amongst us a little bit better?
I think creating spaces is really good. And I think, when you look at the times and you talk about the, the economic, downfall, if you go back to, from 2010, 11, before we had those disturbances and the riots, and we looked at all of the data and statistics that society as a whole was dissatisfied because of the impact of the recession at that time. And you think of all of the kind of years from 2011, 12 up until this particular point, those issues still exist. And I think it is about creating spaces. It's enabling people to talk. So I'm part of a men's group. That's one avenue. I talk about, we need to kind of rethink and reimagine the spaces that we utilize, the barbershop, and all the different places that are in our communities, where we have those conversations. But because we don't acknowledge it as therapy, because we don't use words like mental health, they're quite organic spaces, aren't they? I used to call my barber the therapist.
Yeah.
Why? Since second I sit down, you say, Craig, how's your week?
Yeah.
And I'll start talking. Now, he's not a trained therapist. He's not a counsellor. But I'm offloading and he's just saying he hears me. And all it is I just want to be heard. I just want to be a space there's levels of hearing. Me talking to you is one level, but do you hear me though?
Yeah, and I think also there's a level of like working with people that look like you and understand from like an Afro-centric perspective rather than it being a Euro perspective. Because I know initially when I had my first therapist, I was like, I feel like she couldn't, the things that I probably wanted to offload and talk about, she wasn't really ready for. And it felt like a pity party a little bit, like, oh, I can't believe you're going through that. And I knew it was because you've not lived and walked in my shoes. But then when I got someone that was from my background, it was a different conversation. Do you know what I mean?
Representation definitely matters. And I think, I'm not being controversial, but sometimes representation is not everything, because you might have somebody that looks like you and is terrible.
Yeah, that's
and you might have someone that's not from your background or looks like you and be amazing.
Yeah.
But it is important when we're talking about the context of, we're talking about mental health, we're talking about well-being, and we're talking about professionals, that generally when we're looking at statistics, if you look at how many therapists that look like the people that they're serving, they don't. So representation does matter. Like I said, our therapist is a young Black guy. So working with young Black people, they're just like, wow. But that's just not the be all and end all. And that's why I talk about working with young people and understanding all perspectives. Because you could apply that to, just because it's a Black youth worker, that means you can work with young Black people, and not necessarily.
Might not be that
and so sometimes it's about skill set. But because therapy is one of those things, or mental health is one of those things that, it is real deep. And like you said, you might, I did it for the first few sessions. I'm only giving you 62% of me because, but then also, but you're paying for the service.
Yeah.
And, so there's that kind of, that you need those individuals that understand that if I start to unleash what I really think about this society, are you willing to receive that? So there's also a fear. So we're going into services that we're not taking a real benefit from, because we're also holding
back
bits of us as well. So that's where representation will help and support, because someone can say, you know what, you don't have to say it because I get you. I understand what you're talking about. You don't have to say the word. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes needed. And I'll just throw it out there that sometimes just because somebody looks like you is not always guaranteed. And I think as somebody that teaches youth work, skill set is important. Understanding youth culture is very important.
Yeah.
And I've seen and observed many of those situations that someone might represent, but don't necessarily reflect in certain ways and certain aspects. And I think it's understanding those nuances about race, class, culture, consciousness, and all of those things that become really important to working with people from a specific community.
Thank you so much for joining us on this really powerful episode. There is going to be a part 2, but you're not going to know when the part 2 is going to drop unless you subscribe. This is what I'm saying. We need to get connected. So if you want to see part 2 of this episode with Craig Pinkney, make sure you subscribe, follow us on Instagram, and then you'll be the first to know. Catch up with you soon. Bye.